Good afternoon, everyone. It's noisy. Our task in this course is to look at genocides that are historical so that we can learn from them and hopefully recognize what fosters genocide and then avoid it. Today, we turn our attention to a genocide of the moment, one that is happening as we speak. On the 104th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, we realize that never again is a wish. It certainly is not a reality. It's critical that we recognize that the potential for genocide in this day and age is perhaps greater than ever. Now, about our speaker today. The most important thing to know is that, first and foremost, he is a graduate of Sonoma State University. Now, he went other places later, but the foundation was set right here. Dr. McCuan's primary area of expertise is elections. Local, state, national, dog, cat, you name it, and he's studying elections. And when the next big election comes around, please God, may it be soon, you will turn on the television and you will see a familiar face. His expertise is solicited across the country on all things politic and impolitic. Apart from that, Dr. McCuan is a keen observer of the Middle East. He has traveled a good deal in that area and a few years ago was awarded a Schusterman Fellowship to study in Israel. He pays a lot of attention to groups like ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And the culmination of that is a very popular course in the political science department entitled Terrorism. And I strongly urge you to take it should you get the chance. In the meantime, we are very fortunate that Dr. McCuan has found time in his very busy schedule to be with us today to discuss the tragedy that is Syria. Please welcome him.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be back. This is a pretty dense lecture. It happens fast. I get very excited. I really love what I do. So I'm going to throw lots of things at you. So get ready, and you're going to tell me to slow down. That's okay. Part of the goal here is to not only talk about what's happening in Syria and Iraq, what's happening more broadly with ISIS and what's called the arc of instability, but also to allow you to become expert in this as well. So I'm going to show you a few things that I was updating as late as 3:30, 3:45, because there's one website that you can go to that's giving you a virtually live view of what's happening in the Syrian civil war right now. I'll show you a screenshot from 2 hours ago, along with the Twitter feed and the email feed that happens with that. So you can be right there. But the goal is to get you to become an expert on what's happening in this area of the world and why it's so profoundly important for everything that's going on, elections or not, and how conflict has changed. So I'll start right away with some lessons or some things that are important for you to understand. Before I do that, though, I want to thank the Alliance for having me back, and I want to thank my two colleagues, Dr. Myrna Goodwin and Dr. Diane Parnes, for their stewardship of my own career over the years. I was a sea wolf, but we were the Cossacks back then. There was nothing around campus. I told my father to buy property. He didn't. Otherwise, if he had, I don't know that I'd be doing this gig. But I do love what I do, and as you'll see, this enthusiasm will come through. All right. So let's start by looking at the case of Syria. Let's start with some big ticket questions. Syria is an important case study for genocide and changes in conflict. We don't really use the term war anymore. So I want you to change your lexicon a little bit, change your understanding. War is an outmoded concept that goes away. So with the demise of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the rise of, if you will, of a post-Cold War world, we have been a chronic state of conflict, which has increased again after the events of 9/11. And those that participate in that conflict or in charge of those policies talk about that war as the long war. You might talk about that war, think of that war as the long war or the never-ending war. For those of you that are freshmen, we have basically been at war your whole life. You might not feel that, but that's a very unusual circumstance. And those that are promulgating that war, participating in that war, don't see much of an end in sight. And the Syrian conflict and the genocide against the Yazidis is a perfect example of how this conflict has changed and this ongoing creation of what we call hybrid war or hybrid conflict. Conflict that's never ending. I'm going to show you a few graphics that you'll see that will make some sense in the context of what's going on. Because the Syrian conflict and what's happening in that area of the world is also a proxy for what's happening between the United States and Russia, between what's happening between the United States and Iran, the Israelis, the whole arc of instability. It has, if you will, links to the tragic events in Sri Lanka over the weekend. It has links to what we see in Indonesia, what we see in Libya, and what we see throughout the Horn of Africa going on in Somalia and Yemen. It is a whole arc of instability with changing warfare. So in that sense, we can learn a lot about, from the Syrian case, how warfare has changed and how flexible the terms of war and conflict and political violence have become for us. This also has implications for how groups have responded to this. So when we refer to ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State, IS, and we also look at its affiliates, Al-Qaeda, or its competitors, Al-Qaeda, and its also tentacles out for other groups like Al-Nusra Front, we start to see that groups, while they are in competition with each other, also frequently cooperate with each other. And so this has important implications for U.S. security policy. On the 20th of March, the President of the United States tweeted out, I'll show you the screenshot, he tweeted out a top secret report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which subsequently had to be released 3 days later. He tweeted out an example of a map in the report of how ISIS has changed over time and declared that ISIS was all rolled up. 2 hours ago, there's a report that comes out that explains what ISIS has done in response since that time and how they have altered and expanded their scope of conflict, waiting for the U.S. to leave. And that this has presented a whole host of problems. But what you see is that folks are learning from conflict. Groups like the U.S. military and their adversaries like ISIS or affiliated groups, those that are involved in political violence and genocide, are learning how to promulgate conflict more effectively. They're becoming more effective fighters and knowing how to blend in and how to go back and change and become flexible. And this presents some very important dilemmas for U.S. security policy as a result. Part of this is related to geography of the area, part of it's related to the politics of the area, and a lot of it is related to the energy politics of the area as well. And I'll show you where you can get a lot of this information throughout. So, first, there's the timeliness of this. As Dr. Parnes was kind enough to point out, if we go back 2 years ago to this day, we go back a year ago to this day, we see that the United States was involved in various missile strikes in Syria to send various messages to the actors and particularly to the Russians, but also the Assad government about what was going on, and to punch back and send a message to our potential ability to strike targets within Syria, mostly, if you will, near the Mediterranean, as opposed to those that were closer to Iraq. This also spills over and affects, if you will, message signaling and sending messages to groups like ISIS. In addition to this, if we look at what has happened this past week or month, I'm going to show you this in just a second, we see that groups have responded to this with great fungibility. That conflict in and of itself, genocide, political violence, and the use of violence in strategic ways has become flexible, more strategic and more nuanced. This is pretty scary, especially when you think about everything that you've looked at over the semester and the historical circumstances that you've seen. What you will find in this particular case is that groups are becoming much more savvy about how, where, and when to conduct conflict and to conduct genocide. This is the screen feed from 2 hours ago of what is happening in the live map of Syria in the Syrian civil war. I have a PDF of this that I can send you. That's the URL at the bottom. It's updated all the time. You can grab into it. I have another screenshot for the other side of Syria, the area of particular concern for us. You can grab onto these particular incidents to see what's going on. It's dynamic, and it's linked to what's happening either with local media, with video, with Twitter feeds, the whole 9 yards of social media. It's absolutely dynamic and very interesting to look at. So you get an on-the-ground feel for what's happening. Here's what's happening on the other side. So just to give you some idea, this is the Syrian border, all right, to the east, and this is western Iraq. All right, I'll show you some broader maps here. You'll get lots of maps, you'll see this, but just to give you some context. And obviously those are what? Oil derricks, oil pumps, oil wells, okay, in those areas. Anybody know what this country is? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, okay? So there's a lot of stuff happening in this particular area of the world. Okay, so we're going to use this as a case study, testing this idea of the arc of instability. An arc of instability that runs basically from Africa all the way across through the Middle East, all the way over to the Philippines. And this arc of instability is set forth with a series of rivals. It's dominated by the Muslim world, for example. So we have to talk a little bit about Sunni and Shia and the differences there. And in addition to this, we also have to think about why this particular case is so problematic for U.S. policy. There are no good policy options in this area of the world. No good outcomes. This is about managing crap in terms of policy outcomes, not to put too fine a scientific word on it. All right? This is about managing bad outcomes. Whether you were in the Obama administration or whether you're in the Trump administration, it's about managing bad outcomes. And the U.S. military knows this. There was an attack in the city of Manbij in Syria in middle of January of this year at a cafe that was frequented by U.S. personnel. The best shawarma in that area of Syria. Charcoal grilled meats, very popular. 4 Americans were killed, 2 special forces, a civilian contractor, and a DoD employee. And they were there as part of a regular patrol. ISIS had monitored this for some time and took advantage of it. What's interesting about that particular attack is Senator Lindsey Graham, right? You've seen Lindsey Graham, right? He's a guy who golfs with President Trump from South Carolina. Lindsey Graham was there 6 months prior with no detail, hanging out, eating. It was a totally safe place. The U.S. general of the area in charge declared it completely safe and a place that was a model for the future of how to reclaim areas and how to move past conflict and move past genocide to move into an area of new relations. And it's an area controlled by ISIS today. All right, there was an attack. If you go back to that, if you go back to the live map of Syria, there was an attack there over the weekend on Saturday, an attack the previous Thursday. All right, so the case study of Syria does present some unique opportunities for us. We want to look at that. We want to look at that in light of how conflict or war has changed. I'll show you why information is as important as the barrel of a gun. And we'll look particularly at the Yazidi case to look at what the Yazidis believe and how they were attacked and the genocide that was promulgated against them as visited by the UN and others. All right, so here's what we know about the Yazidi case first. There's a Commission on War-Related Atrocities that's created. Why would that be important? Why would that be important? Why is it important to have a commission on war-related atrocities? Do you have genocide without a commission? Without international recognition? You don't. I was in a killing field in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, 6 months before 9/11, with 15,000 skeletons, with women there combing through the clothing of their husband or their brother the last time they saw them alive in those clothes. 15,000 bodies out of the ground right there. Not part of any type of commission or atrocity and not considered a war crime by any sense because it hadn't been internationally recognized. So this establishment of a commission is hugely important as a criteria for establishing international pressure related to this. Second, there are clear war crimes. I'll show you a few pictures, not too many, of this, both in Syria and in the Sinjar province of Iraq. And they involved all kinds of crimes of extermination and the killing of people in place, the poisoning of land, the taking of women into sexual slavery, a whole variety of things that run the gamut prior to genocide or a series of crimes that create what you might think of as a spectrum of violence. If we're going to think of conflict as changing or fungible, war is out and ongoing conflict is here, we have to think about a ladder of escalation, a ladder that you can climb up and climb down if you're a group using violence. You don't just leap to nuking North Korea. You don't just leap forward to nuking the Iranians. There's a ladder of escalation that statecraft involves, and that groups also know how to increase and decrease that ladder of escalation. And it's used frequently by groups, so that's very instructive for us. You also can find a lot of this if you're interested in this more broadly, something we talk about in the terrorism and political violence class, in terms of what happens for the International Criminal Court and the rules of war, or what we call the LOAC, the Law of Armed Conflict. LOAC, the Law of Armed Conflict. All right, here's the findings, or just the highlights, if you will, of the UN finding that atrocities were committed against the Yazidis in June of 2016. Just giving you the screen grabs is all. Here, both from the UN News and from the paper of record, the New York Times. There are at least 500,000 Yazidis in refugee camps. And the estimate for how many are killed is between 50 and 100,000. It varies widely, all right? There are several mass graves on both sides of the border, as I'll show you the kind of layout of this and what happens. But in terms of what's happening, and in terms of the findings of the UN Commission related to these atrocities, it's the displacement of peoples that's also important. So here's what we're talking about in terms of the Yazidis themselves. It's typically spelled Y-A, not Y-E, but you'll see it both ways when you read about it. So you're talking more broadly about this area. Here's Syria and Iraq. The Russians are down over here mostly. They're negotiating a 40-year lease on a port of Tartus, which will be a naval port. That treaty should be finalized by Thursday. All right, it's been negotiated over the last week and was reported on over the weekend. And we're basically interested really in this border area here. And just so you know, since March 20th, or the release of the DIA report that I mentioned on March 23rd, ISIS-related folks, those that promulgated the genocide against the Yazidis, have left this area of Syria, because US forces are based mostly down here, have left this area and have gone to Mosul, Fallujah, and to other areas right across the border in the Sinjar province. So they've moved and blended in. All right, I'll show you some examples of this and what happens, but nonetheless, just to give you the fungibility of what's happening here. All right, so the Yazidis are a Kurdish-speaking ethnic group, concentrated mostly in northern Iraq, but the idea is that this civil war of Syria and this conflict in Iraq and conflict ongoing in this area of the world with the Kurds and the Turks largely ignores boundaries or borders. It's a borderless conflict, or a trans-border, multi-border conflict. That's an important qualifier for how war has changed. If you think of the Treaty of Westphalia, some of you will recognize this name. If you think about the rules around war, they recognize borders and nation states and legitimate actors. And the argument is that has gone. And this is a great example of how that has changed, where borderless conflict becomes the norm. So the displacement and assault, the killing of populations, particularly minority populations, minority of minority populations like the Yazidis, can be done almost at will and can come and go. They populate Western Iraq and Syria. They have a large diaspora community in Germany, Turkey, the United States. They affiliate often with the Kurds. You've heard about the Kurds. You'll hear a lot about them when Joe Biden announces he's running for president, because he has a plan for the Kurdish state and what to do. And the Kurds are quite large. So this is another example, or an area of where the Yazidis live or have lived historically. There is debate, as I'll present to you, about where the Yazidis originated from, where they came from. They have an oral tradition, it's an informal tradition. There's a lot of components here to the Yazidis themselves. But basically, you are operating in this area across between Iraq and Syria and down into this area. The largest killing field, the largest area of victims that have been found have been in the Sinjar district, where ISIS has migrated across from the Al-Raqqa Valley into just across the border into Raqqa, Iraq, and in the areas outside Mosul and Nineveh, and have taken over around this area, all right? And altered their move from attack structure to kind of moving into a supply and melding back into the population. So as I mentioned, the Yazidi culture is disseminated orally. Not a lot is written down. Their beliefs, right? Their belief structure, everything about them is really transmitted person to person. It's not a religion that you can, or a group that you can convert to or join. Marriage is insular in that regard, all right? And there is debate as to whether or not the origins really come out of from the second caliph or from the Persian term, from Persian origins. They speak a Kurdish derivative language and the Kurdish language itself, and they're believed to have originated from Iran. And they belong to a lot of different groups within the cultures they're in. There's a priestly family who chairs festivals. Those festivals vary. Again, remember the oral tradition component to that. They have a caste system and marry within the community by requirement. All right? You're born into the faith. So it's very insular and small. So then you might ask, well, why does ISIS want to kill them? Or why did ISIS kill them and try to eliminate them? I'll kind of walk you through that a little bit for the dispute, okay? So this is going to sound very familiar to any of you who may have maybe been to Sunday school or driven by a church. How about that? All right? So God created the world to 7 angels, right? The most important angel is the peacock angel. Now, this angel defies God. Sound familiar? And this person, this peacock angel, was forgiven and serves as an intermediary between God and his people. He's an emanation of the supreme God and is inseparable from the supreme God. Sound familiar? Looks a lot like the Holy Trinity. A lot like the Holy Trinity. And in several stories of Islam and in several tomes, this story resembles the peacock angel is not the messenger of God, but Satan. So what does that make the Yazidis? Satan worshipers. This is exactly how ISIS refers to them. They're Satan worshipers. They're devil worshipers. Okay? Right? The peacock angel eventually reconciles with God and serves as that intermediary to earth. But in the Islamic story, that never happens. So the reconciliation that the Yazidis believe and have never happens for the Sunni and the Shia. And ISIS uses this as that basis to call them devil worshippers, to go after them. All right? Basically, they're infidels. And they should be converted or killed. And this leads to long-running, from 2013, 2014, and 2015, killing of the Yazidi people and the sacking of them. And here's some of the data for how many are killed in different areas. 5,000 in Sinjar, in the big killing field, abducting young girls. The estimate of graves, this is from last year of 200 mass graves. That's up to at least 240, 241 mass graves. And evidence was collected by Yazidis of the war crimes because no one would help them, right? So they've promulgated all of this evidence. I'll show you a place at the end where you can read the latest and greatest of this. There's a research project at Syracuse University School of Law that is producing perhaps the best academic research as to what's happening here. And here's one of those killing fields. This is the Sinjar killing field. Is the Iraqi forces around the Yazidi who's coming through and trying to catalog what's going on. You want to read about this. Now I'm going to show you some things that you want to be very careful about. Riley will remember this from the terrorism class. I'm going to show you some things. Oh yes, I see a few, yes, from the terrorism class. Hi. I'm going to show you some things that you want to be careful about putting on your Android or iPhone or your Twitter account or things like that. But you can go to your ex's house and do it, okay? All right. One of these is the Amaq agency, all right? This is the brand new ISIS media agency, the brand new one, all right? They even have an app that's been developed. Why would that be important? Because we communicate with them and we watch them and we listen to them and they listen to us back and forth. Just don't download it on campus, okay? Because we can geolocate your Twitter feeds. I did this once with a group around the Kenyan mall attack and ISIS, and it shot up in the classroom. They all subscribed to the Twitter feed of Al-Shabaab. And I showed them, you could show in the classroom, like in the building where they all subscribed. And now the US government has that information. So be careful, okay? All right, but you can download it for your Android device if you wanted to, all right? So the genocide that goes on, that ISIS perpetuates here, right, is to wipe out these religious zealots, these devil worshippers. They are less pure Muslims, right? They're to be ruled by fear. And not only displaced, but where they lived, not arable, not allowed to come back. This is total genocide, right? Or what we sometimes call, remember that ladder of escalation? Democide. D-E-M-O-C-I-D-E, democide. Complete erase. Complete erasure, completely getting rid of them, their land, and any reference that they were around. Complete murder. How do we know this? Because we could track it. Meaning ISIS is communicating with us. How do we know what happened in Sri Lanka over the weekend? Ta-da, right there. All right? Yeah, it's on my iPhone, before you ask. It is. All right? So the genocide of the Yazidis, okay, starts in full bore. It had been going on low levels. But by June 2014, in Mosul, a major city of Iraq, ISIS, Islamic State, seizes Mosul. The second biggest city in Iraq. The caliphate is declared. And what's a state have to have? What does the caliphate of ISIS have to have when they seize Mosul? What does every government have? Capital, which will become Raqqa. What else? A government, meaning they have to have cabinet officers. They have to have ministers. They have to have a ruling coalition, which is exactly what they set up. They set up a parallel, illegitimate, but competing state. What does every state need in addition to those leaders? Revenue. How do you get revenue? You take over the oil fields. You need revenue, you have a cabinet, and you create a de facto government. Are there other groups that have done this in the post 9/11 era? Al-Qaeda's tried. And if you were in the Pentagon, what would you be worried about? What would you be worried about narco syndicates creating? You would be worried about competing entities creating the ability to educate, bring water and resources to the population because the government can't. What do you think happens in the West Bank? What do you think happens in Gaza? You create competing quasi-state entities called Hamas and Hezbollah, called Al-Qaeda, called ISIS, called a narco syndicate in a Latin American country. The search for legitimacy by these actors alters conflict and creates competition with the state itself and challenges the rule of law and the law of armed conflict. It legitimizes genocide, it legitimizes killing and conflict, and creates a competitive, quasi-parallel state that delivers the things that the population needs. A series of events take place rolling out from this. They take over Nineveh, sections of Tikrit, and where did I show you a map not that long ago of where they were migrating back to and into the population? Those same areas. from which they were eliminated. Last Thursday outside of Nineveh, an ISIS-affiliated group killed at least 33 Iraqi army troops who fled the area of a small village outside of there. Now, ISIS is defeated, right? ISIS has gone away, and the Iraqi army fled from that area and gave up a key strategic point outside of Nineveh, even though this group isn't around. But the group has shown an incredible, uncanny ability to be flexible and to respond accordingly. These mass killings continue throughout. In the midst of an Iraqi civil war, in the midst of the United States extended across the area and spills over into that Syrian region in the midst of a Syrian civil war. So as things get destabilized in Yemen, or in Somalia, or in Indonesia, or in Libya, if you were an ISIS-related leader, what would you expect to have happen? It should be a fertile recruiting ground. And where is that recruiting ground best served, or where do you find it? Right there, on the internet. So the power of information in hybrid war is more powerful, or in hybrid conflict, is more powerful than ever before. The power of the internet is where you find this extremist activity. And I'll show you this here. All right, so here's hybridized war, or hybridized conflict. This really kind of defines the Syrian civil war because it's much more than just a traditional civil war. We have hybrid war. You'll hear it called nonlinear war, chaos theory. Everybody who studies this stuff loves to make up their own terms. It's kind of full employment, and so you'll see this. It doesn't fit the acts or ideas of aggression. It doesn't fit the Geneva Convention. It doesn't fit our rules and articles that govern conflict at all. Because there are no notions of sovereignty. There isn't territorial integrity, and there isn't political independence. There's borderless, non-recognized areas. And remember how the Yazidis were spread across? And in areas, if you will, that were across borders and moving? And this presents a real dilemma, because there is, on the southern part of Turkey, into Syria and into northern Iraq, this group called the Kurds. And the Kurds want to use borderless conflict to their advantage at different times. And guess who used to protect the Yazidis? The Kurdish Peshmerga. And guess who the United States supplied? The Kurds. So this creates a very fungible, difficult set of circumstances. All right? Hybrid war looks like an insurgency. Looks like domestic terrorism. It doesn't really respect alliances, coalitions. One of the big things that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, and the Trump administration would like to do is to create a NATO equivalent in the Middle East. A NATO equivalent in the Middle East. And they've been working on this for some time. At least until last week, again, the timeliness of this, until the Saudis walked out and decided they didn't want any part of it because of what's happening relative to Yemen. All right? But nonetheless, it's challenged by this. It creates what we call in international relations theory a strategic dilemma for the actors involved. It involves violent and nonviolent aspects of hybrids. Remember that iPhone? Remember the power of information? It becomes the currency of this war. And I'm going to show you how powerful this is. So look at this just for a second. It has the psychological aspect of warfare, planned in accordance with public relations scenarios. It includes the leakage of misinformation in a positive light. It demoralizes citizens, leading to negative feelings, and provides defection to the side of the informational aggressor. What happened last Thursday in the United States? What was released? Look at this slide and think of the Russian interference in the 2016 election. The Russians helped pioneer the concept of hybrid war. Don't worry, I'm going to show you evidence of this, right? There's a psychological aspect to the conflict, terrorizing the population and terrorizing the government, so that you can sanction ongoing genocide of a population that nobody really owns or cares about, like the Yazidis. You leak misinformation, you try to weaken one side, shift another against. And here is the graphic from the Russian general in 2013 about how you use misinformation under hybrid war. This is the graphic that he gave and showed. You look at your potential military threats, and you don't want to run to conflict. You don't want to just run to the red all the time. Again, I'll give this in a PDF form to Dr. Parnes. You can grab this. Here are your hidden or unnoticed emergence, the sharpening, and conflict or actions begin. You create a crisis, and you do all of these things. These are the military measures, and look at the bigger scope. The non-military measures. And what are those non-military measures? Organizing political opposition, actions of opposing forces, carrying out complex measures to reduce tensions if you want, destabilizing economies, forming coalitions. How would you do this in Europe? Fund right-wing populist parties. Use social media, influence and interference. So what would you do in the Syrian conflict? The same thing. What would you do in the United States? The same thing. Hybrid warfare carries as its currency information, and the use of information and perceptions, misinformation and misperceptions, to alter what we think. And we've seen this throughout. This is from the Command Staff General of the Russian forces in 2013. Issues a long paper about thinking about hybrid warfare and how to attack and destroy the West, or rivals in some sense. This is a public document. It was part of his command and general staff briefing in his PowerPoint. That's a screen grab that I took of the picture of the PowerPoint with him behind it. Kind of cut it out like he's standing here. Boom, there it is. And that piece right there, you can read the whole. It's like a RAND briefing paper. You can read the whole thing there. And it looks, and we read it because we read their stuff, and vice versa about hybrid warfare. It looks like something you'd see out of a command staff college for the United States. And they were there first. So it's not really, if you will, hybrid warfare, but Hydra-like. So I want you to think of it slightly differently. It's not really a hybrid, different. It is a multi-headed Hydra. So as you attack what's happening with Syria and the Syrian genocide or the Syrian conflict, what do you risk doing? Opening up multiple different avenues, some of which are violent and a lot of which are non-violent. And that's exactly what we've seen, okay? So here's the challenge of this case. We see some traditional components of the Syrian genocide: mass killings, assassinations, indiscriminate attacks, some chemical weapons use. And I want to point particularly here to new weapons testing. Who loves to use drones? We do. Who else likes to use drones? ISIS. So Google ISIS, drones, and images. And it looks like stuff you were creating as a model when you were a child. And where do they order their drones? Amazon. In some cases. Yeah, in some cases. And they make some of them. But they use drones as well. The reason I use drones as an example is the Russians have lost a lot of drones from extensive testing of the use of drones over Syria. ISIS has used a lot of drones, testing them in Iraq and in Syria to use all over in their zones, in their areas of conflict, notably expanding to like Libya and to challenge the Israelis, for example, in Gaza, using drones, and to use drones throughout. The United States has been using drones, but the point is one thing we have seen in the Syrian civil war, in the Syrian conflict, is extensive weapons testing. And that means bombs and bullets, not just drones. It means testing equipment to see what happens. Launching from vehicles and fighters and seaborne devices, things that you wouldn't or aren't quite operational, and therefore using the civilian population, those that are targeted, as what? Yeah, as guinea pigs, as victims. That's exactly what we've seen in Syria. Not quite reaching the level of genocide, but nonetheless, this type of testing going against the rules of war. That's hybrid warfare in action. There's a constant displacement crisis, talking about what we've seen in terms of the Yazidis, for example, and other groups displaced in southern Turkey, northern Syria, and restrictions on humanitarian or HA as a result. All of this creates a perfect case study of how genocide is happening today, but how it's changing in the midst of the post-9/11 or long war period. It provides an instructive lesson for everything moving forward. So here's what it looks like as of April 16th. You get nothing but the best, greatest, latest stuff from me, okay? This is from the Institute for the Study of War. What do you notice about the map? So this is support in the dark brown areas. Attacks are in the red areas. Control is in the black areas. So what do you notice about the control areas in the black for ISIS? They don't exist. But what do you notice about the brown areas of support? They're all over the place. And you notice those thin strands or lines? Why do you think those exist? River valleys. Where would you put underneath the river valleys? Tunnels. Where would you store your weapons and material? Where would you store your wife and your kids? Where would you put them? Underground, in these tunnels, which are extensive in those areas. And what do you notice about these strings of support for ISIS? They run these river valleys, some of them attached or near roads, but they're exhaustive. Even though ISIS has been rolled back and rolled up into very small areas. The United States has a large contingent of troops. Remember, we were going to leave Syria, and then we were going to stay, and then we're leaving, and who knows what we're doing today. They're based right in this area right here. I'll show you some other bases, but the contingent of forces for the U.S. is right about there. Al Tanf. Here's the ISIS Caliphate in 2019. Notice what it says down there? Defense Intelligence Agency. I apologize for the lack of clarity of the graphic. Sorry. Because he tweeted it out. Okay? Let me go back. This is the ISIS Physical Caliphate in 2019 across Iraq and Syria. Iraq and Syria. ISIS territory, right? Residual ISIS presence. What do you notice about the residual ISIS presence? It's everywhere. And it's cross-border by the United States' own admission, as set forth by the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is secret up until March 20th. Then he tweets it out. That's the screen grab from his Twitter feed, March 20th. Even though I have tenure, I'm not on Twitter. But nonetheless, you got to read it. There it was before he took office. Defense Intelligence Agency. Look what we've done. On March 23rd, the Defense Intelligence Agency released a report because they had to. Because, well, he tweeted it out, the most important graphic for it. But it shows this borderless, wide-ranging conflict. With the Yazidis concentrated up in those areas, especially in this particular red area in Iraq, running across over here to Syria, across the border. Here's what it looked like before. Remember those lines? We have Turkish and Syrian rebel allies here in kind of this purple. The Syrian rebels and jihadists in this, I don't know, Easter pink. I don't know what color to call that. The Kurdish forces, Syrian Army, and the Islamic State. The headquarters, not in 2018, in 2013, 14, and 15, is Raqqa. The capital of the Islamic State is Raqqa. This is a nice map giving you what's happening here. Another example, there's that US base where we're currently at. What do you notice about the geography of that US base? What's around it? Well, yeah, this is the Syrian opposition forces. Don't let the blue confuse you. Turkish military backed. But there's not a lot out there. There are a series of, there's a huge oil field right here. All right? And there's an air base there from which the United States is using drones for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to find out what's going on. This base is non-existent here and here as well. And see, remember I mentioned Manbij? Remember that shawarma place? Way up there. So if you look at the US bases in Syria, what do you notice about their location, their geography, their geolocation? They're spread out, and there aren't a lot of them. So how would you seriously handle, from US security policy standpoint, dealing with the situation there? The question you should ask is, why are they so spread out? Because who else is in Syria? The Russians, the hybrid warfare progenitors, the hybrid warfare folks. They're also here. So we have to look at what they say and where they're at. Here's the US forces at their height in Syria. Notice that they were concentrated in this area. And where's the US now? Here. So what do you think ISIS did when the US was up there? They came down here. And so the US is playing whack-a-mole. All right? For lack of a better term. It's very difficult in this area. And you see that Euphrates River Valley? ISIS still has huge amounts of control in that area and support. And there are the Russians. Tatras is the port that the Russians are negotiating to have for a 40-year lease, and that negotiation should be done on Thursday if reports are correct. So notice where the Russians are assembled, notice where the United States is assembled, and now the United States is here, and the Russians are still there. We're down here, so what have we done to the Euphrates River Valley up here in the old capital? Ceded it back to, or given potentially back to, ISIS. Because ISIS is now over here, in Tal Afar and Sinjar, in this area right over here. So this is kind of a dog's breakfast of a hard issue, isn't it? Yeah, it's a real mess. And this is that Al Tanaf area that the US is trying to hold on to. Here is January 2018, so a little more than a year ago. The US pulling back to this area, pulling out of this area because we've defeated ISIS, coming right down here in concentration. And notice that what the Russians have done, they've moved out to T4 and Palmyra during that time. So the Russians are engaging and expanding, the US is pulling back, and ISIS is dissipating. And oh, don't forget the Iranians. They're there as well. And where are they? Oh, they're all over. And in some cases embedded with the Russians, or sharing space with the Russians in some areas. And we don't like the Iranians or the Russians, right? We got this problem here. So what are we going to do? Attack the chemical weapons. Because Assad and his regime uses the chemical weapons. And remember that experimentation and weapons testing component? They use that against the Yazidis as well, and other populations. These are the alleged attacks. And remember where those Russian bases were? And those Iranian bases? So what happens if the United States attacks and kills Iranians? Well, the US probably doesn't care. What about killing the Russians? Russian forces? That might piss Putin off. That might be a real problem. So how do you signal to the Russians that you're coming? That you're launching? You tweet. That's a very good answer. We wouldn't have said that a year or two ago. But I'm going to show you a way that you can monitor what's happening before it's happening. Let me show you. Here's the April 2017 US attack. Site of US airstrike right there. Using Tomahawk missiles launched from the Mediterranean. Mostly you're attacking pro-regime forces. You broadcast this ahead of time, but you're not worried about killing the pro-regime Assad regime forces. You're worried about killing Russians, expanding the conflict, becoming a problem. You've identified different air bases where you know where Russians are at, you know where Iranians are at, and where you know where Iranian proxies are at, those that are trained by the Iranians in Iran. And you want to give the Russians a heads up. Because here's what happened in the 2018 strikes and the 2017 strikes. We launched 59 Tomahawks, destroyed a military field, or tried to, some Syrian aircraft, and then that wasn't enough. And a year later, almost a year to today, we launched 105 missiles, destroyed 9 buildings. 105 missiles. And what does the Russian Ministry of Defense claim happened to those 105 missiles? How many of them were shot down? Even if that's an exaggeration, even if the number is half that, losing a third to air defense would be unprecedented in war. That's a pretty robust air defense system. And here's what happens the day before that strike. So here's your clue to what's happening if you think something's coming down. What do you notice about air traffic, civilian air traffic over Syria? So how do you signal that you're coming to attack someone? Through the international, for the IATA. You send a notice to civilian air traffic about clearing the airspace above a country. And that sends a signal to the Russians that we're coming. And then the Russians do what? They remove their personnel, and we destroy those facilities and don't kill any Russians. The Iranians are not part of the IATA. Okay? The point here is that there's a signaling that goes on between actors that's quite sophisticated to do this. And here's the post-strike response, the deployments as a result. You launch. You say that there's no air traffic over that area, giving you a heads up. And then you send the fleet closer because the Russians have a problem to the stern of those vessels. It's called land. Okay? You push them forward. And this indicates your seriousness. So you try to push them or isolate them as a result. All of this sending a signal, if you will, or information being the bigger currency. Why might this all matter? Here's why. I'm going to show you a couple different pipelines. Here's the Gulf, okay? The southern line that was abandoned in 1948. Iraq here, and you're going to move it across here because it's much faster and easier for transport. So keep this in mind for a second, because this is what it looks like more recently. The Syrian Army, ISIS, remember that control and that need for money? So if you were the United States, what would you blow up that ISIS owns? Would you blow up those? No, no, no. Why do you have those? Because what does ISIS need? Revenue. What do you get with revenue? You get dollars. You get money, right? So, what does the U.S. blow up for ISIS? Banks. They blow up banks and monitor currency. But you have to be careful about blowing up banks, because what do you need to promulgate political violence? You need information. So you want to monitor the conduit of money. The electronic movement of money becomes a key barometer of this new hybrid warfare. You monitor the money and its movement. Because here is the proposed new pipelines. From Doha, from Qatar, up. So you got to come through, remember Al Tanaf right here? For the United States, about right there, which happens to cut, if you will, halfway between this pipeline and this pipeline. And we're about here, so we're slightly closer to the U.S. back pipeline. So the geopolitics of energy mattering a lot in this area. Remember, the Yazidis are right in this area. We're in this area, largely. And the Russians aren't going to sit by with this. They're also going to attack. If you look at the bottom of this, I've given you a key, or the ISW has given you a key of low confidence airstrikes. What do you call low confidence weapons? They're just free-flowing bombs. They're just bombs that aren't targeted. They just drop. And why might that be a problem? Because where do they hit? There are a lot of vagaries here, a lot of variables involved here, and they hit civilians in a huge way. They go off target. Because you're experimenting with different weapons to create terror in the population. Remember, a key element of hybrid warfare is not only the transmission of information, but the transmission of terror, or terror-like tactics, scaring populations, not only or beyond and short of genocide, but including that. And those airstrikes are extensive by the Russians for a long-running period of time. These are areas that are controlled by the Assad regime. This is the the Kurdish group, YPG. That's the capital at the time of ISIS. Notice that ISIS's string, even at this period of time in 2017, is narrower along those river valleys in those particular areas. There are some overlapping areas as a result, with the Russians positioned, if you will, close to the sea. Why would the Russians position themselves to the west and close to the sea? It ain't rocket science. To get out of Dodge, if needed, they can get out. They can get out. The United States is isolated in Al Tanaf. Damascus being the capital, right? Syria, but not as much here as up in this area. And this is, again, that port where they're about to establish a 40-year relationship. So let me give you a reminder of the lay of the land. So here's the area of the world we're talking about, right? This came up last year, so I thought it might be important to add a component about Sunni and Shia, okay? It's helpful to kind of give you a broad lay of the land, right? Disagreement between the Sunnis and Shias going back some time about the rightful heirs, if you will, about who will lead and what will come after the Prophet Muhammad's death. This leads to debates about ideology and religious philosophy, about politics, about boundaries, and this Sunni-Shia divide, which looks different by country. What do you notice about Shias in Iran? They're dominant. Iran is the dominant country. And the Iraqi government has a huge number of Shias in the government, but they're not part of the ultimate ruling council. The Sunnis are. What was Saddam Hussein? Sunni. He was Sunni. So you have in Iraq a long-running series of domination of the minority over the majority. And in Syria, look what you have. The Yazidis would be, if you will, in a miscellaneous kind of category because they're across two countries, here and here. This divide pits, if you will, Iran on one hand, the civil war of Syria with one country in the middle of that, and the Yazidis squeezed right there in the middle, and that would be Iraq or parts of Iraq, or what maybe Joe Biden might call a tripartite division of Iraq. Northern Iraq, center of Iraq, and southern. But it creates a real mess as a buffer in that area. The vast majority, obviously, of the world's Muslims, Sunni, Shia tiny overall, but again, the Iranian component being large here. And here's what it looks like by location. And remember, we're talking about that arc of instability that runs from here to here, if you will. An arc of instability punctuated by this difficulty or rivalry. With a group that is the Yazidis within mostly this particular area. Embedded with the Kurdish population. Remember, they're speaking Kurdish and a Kurdish derivative in that particular area. And we're down here. And the Russians are mostly right over there. And then there's this wild card, ISIS, or ISIL. Or you might have heard the United States, sometimes, and the Brits, we call them Daesh, right? There's a reason for that. You'll see here in just a second. It'll be very clear to you, right? There's the desired caliphate, just in the desire by ISIS for what they would like to see, all right? That's their desired group. This is about the height of their influence and their desired or influence across those areas, 2013. And they tried to create a brand, a very distinct brand. Celebrated videos and beheadings and killings, t-shirts, stickers, apps for your phone, the whole 9 yards. And a magazine called The Beak. So be careful. Do not download The Beak at home. Download it at the library, or come to your favorite professor's office and download it there. Or your ex's, as I mentioned. But the monitoring of The Beak, you can purchase it on Amazon. Why would you? You can just download it. The Beak is an offshoot of the Inspire magazine. There's a version called Inspire, there's called The Beak. And it is their media arm. It is a long-running, like Time Magazine meets Reader's Digest meets Wikipedia. Each download is between 55 to 85 megabytes. It's in full color. You can print it out. It tells you their grievances. Notes their year. It lists those that are partners or allies, and those that are resistors or not true believers. And it tells you how to bake a pie with your mom in the oven, and then you how to make a bomb in the same oven. And that's why the US government's interested in who's downloading it, all right? In the terrorism class, we download all the issues and we read them. We take a look at them because they're great reading, because they give you an introduction into the mindset of their long-running grievances since 632. as to what is true in the world. They're a fascinating read. Do not download it at home. Download it at a public URL, like at a university or a library. All right? And it's a fascinating insight into the media-centered role that ISIS sees, because it lays out their grievances in very particular ways. And the reason that this is important is because you might recall a terror attack in Paris a few years ago. 2 days later, the Dabiq issue was released. On the front cover was the Terror of Paris, with coverage of what was going on. But they released it 48 hours later, which means they had a coordinated media thing already ready to go, the whole 9 yards. However, at the back of that particular issue of Dabiq, they show a series of pictures of a Russian airliner which was blown up over the Sinai and taken down. And they show a picture of the Schweppes tonic can and the blasting cap and the blasting device that went into that can. And a picture of the passports of the Russians that were on the plane and the wreckage of the site. It's the first time they took credit for the attack, told you how they did the attack, and how did they get copies of passports on the ground from victims of the air disaster? Because they're plugged into Egyptian intelligence. They use it as a signaling device for all that they do. That's why we read their stuff, and that's why they communicate to us. They're trying to take Paris and say, look at all this that we did, and in the back, at the end, they say, here's how we did it, what we did, and they show you the actual can that they used. And if you look at the fuselage, they draw a picture, and they show you where they blew the plane up, off the cocktail cart. All right? It's a very fascinating read. So Dabiq is very insightful as to what's going on. So Syria is a conflict without borders, if you will, right? We see areas of control and what those look like and how problematic they are. Some areas held by the Assad government, some by rebels, the Turks. The Kurds have a certain area, the United States helping the Kurds to hold those areas. The Kurds are coming and going in those areas, and the Islamic State in certain areas, presenting some problems. Okay? We look more broadly. We see an array of forces that are here, if you will, for the Kurds, threatening and pushing the Iraqis, with the Islamic State, if you will, scattered across different areas. Again, we're right down here. And it's created, if you will, in this conflict, a huge amount of displacement. This is 2014. There were almost 11 million people displaced. That number has gone up at least 50%. And most of them have moved up here into the Turkish border area. And into this area, Alaska, and then the border camps that are right here. And the Yazidis are right in this area right here at a border camp. IDPs is internally displaced persons, if you haven't seen that term before. IDPs, internally displaced persons. It's one of the measures we have of conflict, of civil war, and of genocide now. And where do the refugees go? They've gone to Turkey, Greece, and Germany, and then up to Germany. That's exactly right. Placing pressure, if you will, on the southern Turkish border. And here's the complicated Syrian case, because there isn't just one free Syrian army, or there isn't just one particular area. There are lots of different competing groups. That we are allied with and sometimes funding through Central Intelligence and through the US government, providing lethal and non-lethal aid. It's a very complicated picture that is going on here in Syria. And here's a great graphic kind of summing that up. Here's what we have happening on the Assad side. the Syrian government side with the Iranians, Hezbollah, and militias, with help from Russia, the Iranians to all groups, the Iraqis. The Kurds in the middle here. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait supporting the Army of Islam. The FSA supported by us. And elements and offshoots. And oh, remember them? Whose side are they on? Oh, whoa, we're all over here. In other words, allegiances and alliances in hybrid warfare become what? Fungible. They change all the time. This is another reason the Syrian case is so valuable for us in this new world order. And here's al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Let me talk briefly about them. So there's the flag that you've seen from time to time. They've worked against minority Christians, Yazidis, Shiite Muslims, all kinds of different groups, mostly in Iraq and Syria. They perpetuated the 7/7 2005 London subway attack. They form out of Al-Qaeda and versions of Al-Qaeda. There really isn't one Al-Qaeda. You have to think of Al-Qaeda kind of like as the original McDonald's, and then there are offshoots, right? Five Guys, In-N-Out Burger, Burger King. It's like the franchise identifier, and then there's a bunch of offshoots and competitors to it for Al-Qaeda, all right? These are their early highlights of ISIS. They take control of Syria's largest oil field. Al-Qaeda, when it's losing after 9/11, 2005, 2006, a very famous internal management memo is written that if you want to move up in the organization, you have to engage in spectacular grab and hold attacks. Grab and hold attacks that grab the media's attention and promulgate violence in a huge way. And one of the best places to grab and hold is an oil field in Algeria or Syria, because you grab and hold the isolated oil field, and then you move through that oil field and you get everyone's passport and you target them. And where do we first see this grab and hold technique? In Mumbai. All right? So a management memo is written to move up in the organization. You have to engage in spectacular, dramatic attacks. So you need moments that can be captured on CNN and run on social media over and over and over. So what do you need if you're ISIS? A YouTube page, a Facebook page, an Instagram page, at least until it's taken down. You need social media components to take advantage of this to document your genocide. Information being that key currency here of the hybrid warfare, all right? You have the video beheadings of the two Brits. A series of executions. The burning alive of the Jordanian pilot. Because the beheading of Daniel Pearl in Pakistan was dramatic and seen over and over and over again. And it's that type of dramatic terrorism that is needed in the hybrid warfare environment. So here was their 5-year plan. Not recognizing borders, having new borders with traditional names. Where does the UK Daily Mail get this? From Dabiq, or an earlier component of Dabiq. You notice Spain? Andalusia, right? So you have to have a global campaign. There is the arc of instability. And what's that country right there? There's Sri Lanka, right? Part of the arc of instability. So you're popping up and growing across the arc of instability. You conduct military operations in some areas and terror operations in others. Across that arc of instability. France, Great Britain, Germany, wherever you can operate. And this is Daesh, ISIS at its height. extortion and taxation, steal money from banks, oil, and ransoms. Identify your leaders, put it on social media, which made targeting very easy. And what does that look like? It looks a donkey, otherwise known as a jackass. Okay? So, right? And if you think back to when you first started hearing about ISIS and Daesh, you started hearing Secretary of State John Kerry refer to them as Daesh or Daesh all the time because he was being derogatory in a diplomatic way. He was calling them a bunch of jackasses. And doing so while we're still working out whether we call them IS, IS, ISIS, ISIL, and so forth. And who is that? That's the leader, al-Baghdadi, who's a jackass. Okay? This is actual propaganda picture that's used. So the West is referring to them as jackasses in a derogatory, insulting way. Competing organizations like Al-Qaeda create these caricatures. And you have this going on. This is in Palmyra, Syria, as they take over an area. Remember, that's al-Baghdadi, the leader of Daesh or ISIS. And when they take over, what do they create? A de facto government, a cabinet, leadership councils, deputies. They identify a whole series of leaders. They create a financial council, military council, all the way through, just like you would see in a regular government. They create a competing, parallel, quasi-legitimate organization for areas of the world to legitimize the conflict, to legitimize the grievances against the Yazidis, against minority populations. He's got a Ph.D. And he's still alive. And he lives in Iraq. Notice that he founded this group, Al-Jamal, in 2003 to fight U.S. forces. So what was he doing before that? Being paid by the U.S. not to fight. And then we tried paying him again as part of the Petraeus strategy in 5, 6, 7. He took the money but still fought against us. And the competing organization to ISIS is Al-Nusra Front. This is not the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. It's not Al-Qaeda proper, and it's not ISIS. This should just give you some idea of the element of the competing organizations that are going on in this big gang of new fighters. All right, so here are the lessons for today. Wait for your great questions. We have civil wars, been the traditional thing that we've looked at. Civil discourse and negotiations. We have in the Syrian case, right, we try to deal with counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. These are all the things the United States tries to do in fighting ISIS or dealing with genocide or dealing with the Syrian situation or Iraq. All of the things that we try to deal with in terms of creating policies. Do we confront and arm? Do we engage in negotiations? How do we signal? What do we do? Because it's a lot like this. This is great power rivalries. Some of you will know that this is Dr. Strangelove, which was a mockery, if you will, of the insanity of what was going on with two giants getting ready to nuke each other. Okay? But the bluster of what was going on and illustrated in this film is part of the bluster that's going on between actors that perceive themselves to be legitimate and equal. ISIS and its leaders perceive themselves to be legitimate actors to engage in negotiations, just like we are doing in Afghanistan with the Taliban right now, and we would never have done 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, or 12 or 15 years ago. And the Syrian conflict establishes all of these true paradoxes that are similar. This is not a big leap of faith. Why? Because the Syrians were trying to develop nuclear weapons. Who was helping them? The North Koreans. So the quest for legitimacy, the quest for bigger bombs or bigger weapons, or the quest for, if you will, the ability to respond in negotiation, realpolitik, and what we call often realism in international relations, is evident from this case. The Israelis knew this and bombed the reactor, or the beginning parts of the reactor. And finally, the spillover effect of this conflict is one of the hallmarks of genocide today. The migration of Syrian asylum applications, the spillover of refugees, the growth of these refugees and asylum applications, and the targeting of particular groups like the Yazidis, all examples of this. So the Syrian case becomes, if you will, a great place near the end of the semester to think of this for how genocide is changing. And do the Russians know this? Remember, they were ahead of us in hybrid warfare. This is a rally in Aleppo just before Christmas time in December of 2017, orchestrated by the Assad regime. There he is back there, celebrating Russian and commemorating Russian war dead by the Syrians. Indicating several Russians that had been killed in the war. Not all of them victims of rebels. And it stretches way back. I have a graphic that I took out. It was just didn't have very good visuals that shows the length of this for the Russian war dead in that particular area, or in this particular fight. And finally, if you want to read about this, you can grab this from the Syracuse project on the Syrian Accountability Project, which has a lot of this in the discussion of the Yazidis themselves. This is a project that's funded through the Syracuse School of Law. Students participate, undergraduates and graduate students and law school students in this project. And it's a great read. It's extensive, a lot of things in here as well. With that, why don't I take your questions, comments, concerns. Thank you all very much.